Hey everyone. So I'm going to talk about how cyber war is boring. For a bit of background, I'm Paddy. There's a bit of noise picking up. And I'm normally someone who does cyber things. That's what I'm supposed to do. I'm originally from TU Dublin, but I spend more of my time as the community manager for the open source, or for the Arms Control network of blogs and podcasts, where I mostly plan the needs of open source intelligence analysts for the future and do some research in myself, some of which I've been lucky enough to have in the Washington Post and The Economist. And as well as this, normally I have a giant blog written with everything that I have sourced and some more things I'm not going to have the chance to talk about in a talk. I don't have that blog written because this talk was written in 9 days for B-sides. So if you go to that link, that'll eventually there will be a blog post up with everything you need from this. As well as this, a quick disclaimer. I am going to be talking about the war in Ukraine. If you are sick of the war in Ukraine, this is definitely not the talk for you. There is no dead bodies or anything like that, but there are equipment on fire, that kind of thing. So if you have PTSD or any triggers like that, this might not be the talk for you. And finally, I stopped adding things to the presentation about 36 hours ago, and I know some things have changed since. I am aware of those, but at some point I have to stop talking. So, the genesis of this talk comes from a friend of mine, Don Edwards, who said that there's been a lot of talk about cyber warfare, but yet we have yet to see anything. So I'm going to try and explain why we aren't seeing it, and more importantly, why it's quite a lot less interesting than a lot of people are led to believe. And the idea for war is boring comes from comic book artist David Axe, who said that cyber war is a lot more about politics, paperwork, and logistics than it is about the actual combat. And in a lot of ways, I think cyber is the same, but rather it's more about politics, the legalities around cyber, and then perceptions that people have of cyber. So if we look at the politics, looking at cyber through the lens of Clausewitz is kind of the best way to kind of think about how cyber impacts people in these kind of ways. So how states actually use it. And much like war, cyber is an extension of policy by other means. This is to say that if you look at the world as a runway, you have a number of actions that governments can take. They have the runway that is as long as it is, and then using cyber or going to war allows you to add length onto the runway for you to continue different actions. Great example of this in recent memory comes from this thing here. This is called the Bronze Soldier. It's a statue in Tallinn, Estonia. This originally used to be in the city centre in Tallinn, and it marked the graves of 12 Soviet soldiers who died fighting the Nazis in World War II. Estonia continued fighting for their freedom from the Soviets into the 1950s. I think 53, 54, they were still fighting the conflict. So to a lot of Estonians, this statue represents a kind of a way that they've had their freedom crushed by the Soviets. And to a lot of ethnic Russians, this statue represents victory over the Nazis. So this becomes a contentious issue. And in the city centre, they decided we're going to move the statue, the government, and they're going to move it elsewhere. And of course, this generated protests, and the protests ran for a period of about 2 weeks. But in those 2 weeks, the Kremlin started playing around with what we have become familiar with today as cyber warfare. They started with DDoS attacks, they defaced various websites, but the thing that really got people motivated and got them going was commenting on news articles. And this would generate massive rumors that people would then spread around and talk about outside of these news articles. This then led to people having ethnic Russian speakers then looking at this and going, this is cultural genocide. This is our heritage being destroyed. And when you look at those things in that lens, rather than this is a complicated symbol which has a lot of intricacies around it, and you simplify it to that one narrow thing, it then all of a sudden gets a little bit difficult. So then over the course of about 2 days towards the end of April in 2007, riots erupted in Tallinn. They originally came from where a Kremlin-backed protester started to punch police officers. And of course, we have seen how police tend to respond when you punch them. So this strategy is what's called hybrid warfare. This is, it's not a really well-defined idea. I kind of think of it best as it's strategically aimed political warfare against democracies and democratic institutions. So, for example, the government of Ireland is a democracy. You can target various operations against them, or you could look at democratic institutions. So when Russia used chemical weapons in 2017 in Salisbury in the UK to assassinate the Skripals, what they were doing there was they were taking advantage of vulnerabilities that existed in the democratic organization, that is the organization for the prohibition of chemical weapons. And the way that hybrid warfare works is that it blends a number of different means of warfare. So conventional warfare, which we've seen with the uprisings that are backed by Russia in the Donbass and Luhansk. Irregular warfare, as we saw when the little green men, which are Russian soldiers, turned up without badges, which is, legally dubious, in 2014 in Crimea. As well as that, we see cyber warfare, even as recently as a couple of weeks ago, where we've seen websites being defaced, DDoS attacks, and you could say the Bears are doing it, you could say Ghost Rider is doing it, maybe it's both of them doing it, maybe one is doing it at the behest of the other. And then finally, influence operations, which is the stuff we see on a regular basis when it comes to disinformation, maybe in terms of propaganda, which various governments are putting out, or in the old Russian favourite of active measures where they actually try and influence the direction that certain things are taking in governments. A great example of that is the 2016 election in the United States. And this entire idea falls into what's called grey area operations. You can have normal diplomatic relations where, for example, we recently saw Micheál Martin in Washington, D.C. He meets with President Biden. They have their back. Well, I don't think they actually met because he's got COVID now. But in theory, what's supposed to happen is he hands him this little basket of shamrocks, and that is like our little bit of solidarity standing with them. These are long-standing traditions that governments have in interacting with each other in very normal ways. Sometimes it's where IDA Ireland attracts businesses into Ireland. Sometimes it's in the form of visiting academics coming here to teach skills, or how we teach skills to, say, for example, doctors in other part of the world here in Ireland. Then you have armed conflict, which is the actual war fighting that we see in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine at the moment. And in between there is where we tend to see most of cyber operations happening. It's where states are looking at this grey area between war and not war. And they work in the area of not war to try and maximize any kind of advantages to advance their goals. So, as well as this, there's the legal aspects of it. There's a very important point in when we look at cyber attacks in the international law terms, where the criterion for one of the three criterion to define a cyber attack is that they are violent in nature, which is to say that, again, looking at Clausewitz, they cause damage or destruction to property, or they injure or kill people. And as we have seen, there are arguments to be made for Stuxnet, so there's a little caveat there. But to date, we're not aware of ransomware, for example, actually killing someone. The Germans have tried to prosecute that. We're not aware of, while there are attacks using insulin pumps, we're not aware of one of them actually being used to injure a patient on an insulin pump. And we're also not aware of, while the theory exists in the likes of the Triton malware, we have yet to see anything actually damage or destroy equipment. If you look at this as well, then in Irish law, the only place that the word attack exists is in the preamble to the law. The reason for this is in Irish law, the word attack is a charged word implying violence in it. And as we have also seen, there has not been violent cases taken there as well. So when you go and read through the Act, you see it as like interfering in the transmission of, or intercepting in the transmission of, rather than he did an attack. Which leads me to take this really useless slide everywhere I go and hand it out to people. But the three important bits on it are, there is some kind of a cyber operation. Someone is using cyber somewhere to accomplish some goal. the person who is doing it for violent ends. So they're looking to damage or destroy property or kill or injure humans. And finally, that whatever intrusion is taking place is being someone who is subject to international law. So when you're looking at this in regular terms, all of us in the room here, we're regular individuals. We are not subject to international law. If someone here is in the military and they're taking part in military operations, they are subject to international law. If there is, the whole government can't be in the room, but if the government is taking various different actions, they are then also subject to international law. So you need to meet all of these criteria to actually be committing cyber attacks. And this has then led Thomas Rid to go on in a paper he wrote to describe how cyber war will not happen. He has said it has not taken place in the past. It is not taking place now, and it is highly unlikely that it will take place in the future. And a lot of his thinking for this comes from a lot of what we see is sabotage, espionage, and more importantly, subversion. A lot of what we see on a day-to-day basis in regular cyber, what major cyber actors are doing at a state level against other states is espionage and subversion. And then recently a paper was written by an academic called Leonard Meshmar, where he coined the idea of the Subversive Trilemma. This is where he set a set of criteria that defines the difference between what is theoretically possible with what is practically feasible. Because theoretically, the US still launches its nuclear weapons using 5.5-inch floppy drives. In theory, I can find out where they are doing them, minting those floppy drives, lay my hands on them, put some kind of corrupt data on them for my own ends, and use them to launch nuclear weapons. But is that actually practically feasible as a thing you can do? Well, to understand if it is, his criteria for looking at that come down to operational speed, the intensity of effects, and system control. And these are all interlinked. So, the faster you move means you have less time to do reconnaissance. You have less time to develop your exploits. You have less time to use the exploits and not get detected in the process. And then when you do get into a system on the other side of the exploit, to learn whatever that's connected to, how these various systems work. If you get in the other side of a telephone switch, for example, is it in Ericsson, where Ericsson have their own language for programming telephone switches completely separate to what other companies use? Or on the other side of it, are you only familiar with Cisco systems, and then all of a sudden there are Juniper systems on the other side of it, and you might need to learn the various different commands to use them? And linked to this is, if you move fast, you're obviously not going to have big effects with your cyber, because obviously what you've done is not taken the time to develop these intense effects in the end. And then how much control do you have over it? The more commands you issue on a system, the more noise you make, and the more noise you make, the higher chance you have of being detected. So if we then compare and contrast Stuxnet to what we've seen recently in Russia, Stuxnet took about 5 years to develop and cost the entire Olympic Games program cost somewhere around $1 billion and resulted in technically 2 pieces of malware and 1 patch. Using that kind of speed, they had incredible effects with the first version of Stuxnet, which is known as 0.5. It was used between 2007 and 2008 in Natanz. It ran completely autonomously without any C2, and they used a system they had built in the Y12 National Security Facility in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, to actually run a small-scale demo of the system. And then there's the destructive one that, well, not destructive, but the one that everybody is familiar with, which is the one that became the worm. So if you look at the way these kind of things worked in different fashions, one of them resulted in possible equipment destruction, and the other one did nothing but slow the nuclear program down. So you ended up with roughly similar lengths of time that it took to develop and use them, and you had 2 wildly different effects. One of them also ran completely unknown and wasn't detected until 2013, when it was detected by accident in VirusTotal. And the other one, as soon as it went loose in the wild, everybody knew about it and it was all over the news. So melding these things together, Stuxnet is a probably successful program that took a lot of time to have really specific intense effects using a lot of control over these systems. But you can't move fast and have the other two effects. So they did it really slowly. Russia then, on the other hand, well, as Live UA Map got their hands on a number of documents related to the invasion, Vladimir Putin approved it on the 18th of January. They were to start on the 20th of February. Obviously, it didn't start for another, I think, 8 days. Maybe that's US information operations having worked very successfully to put off that attack. Maybe it's because they weren't able to get their false flag. Who knows? We probably won't know for a long time. And, of course, to end on March 6th, which, that's going well. So, this is the kind of trade-off where they had very limited time to develop their attack plans and to develop systems, or to develop malware inside systems that they could use for big effects that people kind of expect. And that's not what we've seen. Now, maybe they did have stuff planted already, but that's an idea I'm going to come back to in the future. Finally, the other thing is perceptions. When we were seeing the cyber partisans in Belarus ransomwaring ticket machines, or when we were seeing the Ukrainian websites getting defaced, Adam Boileau said, this is not the cyber war we're promised. And I think a lot of this comes down to this. This is the kind of picture that people have when they look at... This is a real picture of a real military unit, the 780th Military Intelligence Brigade, right? You have like, is it going to work? It is. This dude here, he has a USB cord being used as a sling for his rifle. This guy has a trigger finger and he's holding it away from the trigger like he's ready to fire safely, right? And then, of course, you've a nerd like me who's a custom cherry keyboard, right? So we end up with, like, this is the picture we kind of have of what cyber should be. But if we then look at other forms of warfare and how they kind of compare, my favorite Iowa-class battleships, they fire a Volkswagen Golf 30 nautical miles with a grand piano worth of explosives. They don't really exist in war anymore. But, you know, if you think modern naval combat, this is one of the ideas that people have. Another idea that people have is Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. They fire missiles out of vertical tubes and they go away and fly and blow things up. But this isn't where naval warfare got its start. Naval warfare started about 4,000 years ago in ancient Egypt, where they literally built land on top of boats so that they could have land battles on a boat at sea. This is how naval war got started. So there is a train of thought that has gone through millennia that has developed to where we are today with naval warfare. We see the same thing with aircraft, where, for example, we have stealth aircraft that have, like, in this case, a particularly fantastic weird metal camouflage system for some reason. But that's not how aerial combat got started. Aerial combat didn't even start as combat. It started as men throwing hand grenades out of planes and using the Mark I eyeball to try and determine where this will land. And this is another idea that Clausewitz had, is that every age has its own limiting conditions on warfare and peculiar preconceptions that impact how people think about war. And a great example of this comes in World War I, where we had cuirassiers. These are a type of horse infantry that can fight on horseback with sabers and dismount and fight with guns, right? And they have horsehair helmets and breastplates like someone is going to come at them with a lance on a medieval battlefield 500 years prior to this actually existing. But this unit doesn't go away, because the ultimate idea of it is units that can fight mounted on something and then dismounted. And we can see the exact same unit exists today. That's them doing counter-terrorism operations in Mali. There are guys on the ground, dismounted, ready to fight, as well as these dudes here, who are in, like, their recon tank thing, right? And we see them again where they actually have full-on tanks as well as dismounted infantry that are fighting dismounted. So while the entire idea of how cavalry is used in warfare has gone away, the way that they fight remains exactly the same. They have limiting conditions on what they can do as a fighting force. And if you then look at cyber, I prefer to think of it not so much as cyber, but as information warfare for a number of reasons. And one of them is it's something that's been thought about for a very long time. Sun Tzu has been thinking about this for about 2,500 years, 2,600 years now, where he essentially wrote the book on information warfare. He talked a lot in his book about how you can use deception to hide your strength. Deception operations are something modern militaries take part in all of the time. If you look at how some of cyber is being used, the hermetic wiper that we seen in Ukraine last week, it tried to deceive operators as to what it was actually doing by running ransomware at the same time as it was physically wiping systems. And then, as well as that you protect your own forces using operational security. And day to day, a lot of the cyber things that we do are operational security elements, where we're attempting to secure access controls on how you gain entry to various systems, or who can gain entry to systems, or do you meet the criteria to gain entry to this system. We also use the work of this man here. This is an Islamic scholar, Al-Kindi, from 1100 years ago. He invented most of modern cryptography. Not only did he come up with most of modern cryptography, he came up with a lot of things. He's a polymath. He kind of invented modern chemistry, modern Islamic scholarship, Islamic philosophy, optics. But the thing he's most famous for in our realm, or at least should be, is if you've ever done cryptanalysis, if you've ever done frequency analysis of various different pieces of encrypted information, you can thank him for that. And while we still use a lot of his techniques today, pen and paper using his methods were used until mechanical encryption came around in the 1920s. So he had about 1,000-year run of protecting information very securely using systems. And if we then go to World War I, we have this group here. This is Room 40. These are the people who birthed the idea of signals intelligence. Germany, what they were doing in World War I was they had a bunch of code books, but they weren't to hold encrypted information. They were books that were like hundreds of thousands of pages long, and they had entries in them for any message that you could possibly think of that you might want to send in peace or war. And what you would do is tap out that message on page 4522. And that, when that gets relayed back, they then know, okay, I am headed north out of Kiel. And that's all it means. But they got their hands on the code books, they started to figure out how to decipher them and how to use them. And then they were able to use them to kind of force battles on the Germans. These things called decisive battles. Not going to get into it. But not only that, they also came up with another idea which has become very important in, not just in cyber, but generally in information warfare, called radio direction finding. If you've seen the lady earlier who was talking about open source using SDRs for radio frequency analysis, it's the same kind of idea. Can you pinpoint where in the world a transmitter is based on how it works? If you've ever had to try and find your Wi-Fi box in an apartment that you've just moved into, you want to find the code to use it, you can use your phone and you can watch the strength increase as you walk along. It's the same kind of idea. But they turned the entirety of Britain into a radio antenna, and they were able to very precisely figure out where various ships are. So when German mine-laying operations were taking place, they knew exactly where those ships were to a huge degree of accuracy, and they were able to then figure out exactly where the minefields were. And when the Battle of Jutland happened in 1916, they were able to chase the Germans into their own minefields because the British knew where they were. This then comes on to World War II, where we have dudes like this. This is an operator of a system called HFDUF, high frequency direction finding. This is how they hunted U-boats. The idea here is you move in a line, and as you move along, you are watching the radio frequency on the little scope thing he has there update as the U-boat is putting out its Morse code. And that allows you to then figure out the location of that U-boat in space, go and depth charge it, sink it. And ultimately, this then brings us on to Claude Shannon, who came up with this mathematical theory of communication. This then becomes not just the fundamental underlying theory of how most cyber works, it also becomes the fundamental underlying of how a lot of information warfare works. Because ultimately, he's talking about how electrons fly around in space. Electronic warfare is all about manipulating those electrons in space. And if we jump forward into the future then, this is part of Waypoint 2028. This is how the US Army intends to fight wars against what they call near peers. It's a very fancy word to say China. And in it, they have two major elements. One is the Theater Fires Command. The Theater Fires Command is basically, instead of having you pick up your radio and call down to the artillery battery attached to your unit, you call Theater Fires Command instead. And Theater Fires Command will use the assets they have at their disposal, land, sea, air, space, and information, to then be utilized against your adversary for maximum effect. Now, that could mean using one on its own. It could mean using all five for maximum effect. It could be any number in between. They will use the assets that they have available at that time to deliver the most fire that you need. And the other one is this fun unit little here. This is the Theater Information Advantage element. And this is the cyber people. Information advantage is something that allows you to think and decide quicker and more effectively than your adversary. So when you're fighting in a war, if I have better information than anyone else, I know more about you and what you're doing, your unit dispositions, and how to best fight against you with what I have. So the US is attempting to do this, and they're attempting to do it what they call enhanced non-lethal capabilities to conduct information warfare, to protect friendly information and inform and influence activities through forward-postured, persistently engaged, blah, blah, blah. All of this comes from the 2018 US DoD Cyber Strategy. This is a policy document that they're giving to lawmakers to understand how the Department of Defense is going to be fighting wars. So what they're saying to policy people is cyber. But what they're saying to the troops is information warfare. So these are the peculiar preconceptions that then we have when it comes to cyber. It's a problem that's existed for about 2,500 years. People have been thinking about it for about 2,500 years. And it's not something that's just stuck to what I can do on computer magic keyboard cyber bullet pew pew pew. As well as that, Claude Shannon being the fundamental underlying theory of how it's used imposes a number of limitations on these systems. You can only open up a certain number of attacks because there's only a certain number of vectors here, unless, of course, you want to attack yourself, but that's not great. So this opens up attacks where you can degrade. These are what are considered attacks against information itself. My favorite example of this, it's not exactly coming up great, unfortunately, on the slide, is NotPetya. NotPetya is ransomware that was delivered by Sandworm in 2016 using the Eternal Blue exploit. And to move faster through the network, they also had Mimikatz attached to it so that any credentials that were sitting in memory, they would use to continue moving along the network and propagate the worm, where it would encrypt as ransomware all of the systems. When they had all of the systems encrypted, they would delete the master boot record and then delete the partition table of where all of the files are. So even if they didn't delete the encryption key, which they did do, you still wouldn't be able to recover any of your files. The entire idea behind this was destructive. And the reason they did this was it was distributed through Ukrainian tax software called MEDOC. They backdoored the update servers for it, and they used that to distribute it then to anyone who was doing accounting in Ukraine. You had to have this software. So this resulted then in anyone who had this just losing their data indiscriminately. And this is just because Russia doesn't like Ukraine. So then if we pivot to today, I love this. This is what hackers have been doing, attempting to jam Russian communications by drawing My Little Pony and bumblebees and whatever that lion thing is. So when you, I don't have audio for this one, but what you hear when they're doing this is they're just putting out at specific frequencies beeps. And these beeps come across, it sounds like if you've ever picked up the phone when we had dial-up. It sounds exactly like that. It's exactly the same thing. And they're doing this to try and mess with Russian tactical communications. As well as this, we've seen Ukraine inserting latency into GPS communications, which means that the Google Maps locations that Russia is using to target Russian or Ukrainian facilities, such as this air defense facility, because they're inserting the latency, and we're talking about things that rely on atomic clocks, tiny bits of latency mean you end up off by meters in your actual artillery fire. So when they're trying to blow up these systems, they're unable to. You can also deny access to information. The easiest and most common way to do this is to attack the receiver itself. In intelligence terms, you have collection assets, where these could be, for example, a webcam that you have in a building in Kyiv, and you're using that to actually watch what's going on. So you would attack the camera. Now, you could do that by cyber means, but, sledgehammers are pretty useful. A great example of this comes in 2019. At the end of 2019, there was, I don't know if anyone remembers that the other time recently we nearly had World War III, where Iran and the United States were kind of at loggerheads over a number of different issues. One of the things that happened was the US flew a Global Hawk drone very close to Ukrainian airspace. This is essentially an intelligence gathering drone. And when it crossed what Iran believed to be the line that demarcated Iranian airspace from international airspace, they immediately shot it out of the sky with one of these batteries, a Sevram Karad. And in response to this, as a show of force, what the United States did was they attempted to take out the fire control computers that actually allowed you to launch the missiles using cyber means. Now, we don't know the specifics of what it is. All we have is, for example, this New York Times report that says it worked, trust me, it's fine, and a few other reports that go along similar lines. So you can use cyber to take out these receivers, but as we've seen in the current conflict, bombs are kind of a hell of a lot more useful when you actually want to take them out. The other interesting thing you can do is, instead of attacking the receiver, you could look at who is using the information and attack them. So, for example, instead of taking the receiver, what if you leave the receiver up, but you decide, we want to figure out where the analysts are, and then attack that facility? This is something the US did in the first Gulf War, where this was Saddam's regime command center, where all aspects of the Iraqi military were coordinated from. And in the left is the pre-strike, where they had decided where all of the important facilities were. And then the right is post-strike, where they had targeted and attempted to destroy as much of them as possible with varying degrees of success. Ukraine, on the other hand, has been doing something slightly differently, which is... That is Bayraktar drone strike. You've seen them recently in the news against a Russian command post, where they're attempting to degrade Ukraine's ability to actually fight by taking out their generals. And as of 36 hours ago, this is the list of dead generals and high-ranking officers of various different ranks. I would note there are 2 more to be added to this list since then. And this is removing the ability for high-level Russian forces to actually go forward and fight. So when you're sometimes looking at not the stalled convoy, that's probably logistics, but if you all of a sudden look at why they have resorted to brute force shelling in certain parts of the country, or they have resorted to stall defensives, it's probably because they've no one to make the final call, because who wants to, decide we should attack or should not attack when people mysteriously just fall out of windows in the country. So You can also then corrupt information sources. Now, this isn't where you attack information itself. This is where you inject noise into information systems so that you can do various things. So Israel has these jets here. These are a signals intelligence and an electronic intelligence aircraft. And the one in the foreground was part of a raid into Syria in 2008 where they were attempting to blow up a suspected Syrian nuclear weapons or nuclear reactor that was being constructed. And when they were going along, this is what the radar picture looked like to the operator. But using electronic warfare, you can do what's called painting a false sky picture, where you give a false sense to the operators of what it looks like by essentially injecting bits into the radar. So they go along, and all of a sudden, this is the radar picture. Nothing has changed apart from the formation of Israeli units has vanished. And that's all because the bits they're sending along are saying, there's nothing here, ignore me, don't look at that. And we see this today in a lot of different ways. Recently, OpenFacto, who is a French fact-checking website, discovered that there's a group of websites called InfoRoss. And InfoRoss is approximately 1,300 different websites that are run by Russian military intelligence. And what they are doing is basically acting as secondary propaganda arms to the state. So not just have they RT, Sputnik, those kind of news media sites that are kind of showing particular views of the world that the regime is happy with. They also run secondary propaganda operations that are doing local level to, like, the rayons, they're oblasts. These are regions, so like County Dublin, County Galway, County Louth, those kind of things, as well as municipalities. So targeting not just all of Dublin, but Greater Dublin. And then you could target cities, so like Limerick and Cork, and you would have specific propaganda targeted at those areas as well. You could also do cool stuff like this, which is after the Russians brutally destroyed one of the greatest pieces of humanitarian equipment the world possesses, the AN-225 Mira. People then decided, well, we can spoof ADSB data. We're going to bring it back to life. We're going to fly it in laps around Kyiv, and we're going to have the call sign be, fuck Putin. And then something that I have to keep in mind for cyber people is when we're talking about corrupted information sources, we can use algorithms to create tailored messages for people. My favorite example of this is Twitter. You can have a look at Twitter, and a few years ago, you used to get, as things came in, by the second, everything that was happening in your feed. But now you don't get that. You get the curated picture of what Twitter wants to show you based on whatever filter bubble they have pigeonholed you into. This could also be used for, like, while Twitter can do, like, okay jobs of it, this can be used for malicious purposes. My favorite example of that in recent memory is when the Chinese property giant Evergrande was collapsing. It was huge news here in the West, but it was essentially not talked about beyond the Great Firewall. And any time people tried to send this information beyond the Great Firewall, mysteriously vanish. So you can use this to create curated pictures of what the world looks with algorithms. And then finally, we end up with attacks that exploit information. And this isn't exploit in the traditional cyber sense. This is exploit in intelligence terms, where you are looking at how things are, for example, how data is moving around in your network and what you can learn by those data flows in your network. So, for example, exfiltration. Can you look at how various things are happening in your network and see that that's an unusually large number of DNS text requests being made out to that weird server? What's going on there? So you can then figure out maybe someone's exfiltrating data, and you can decide to take actions based on that. So we can then go to this. This is my favorite game recently that I've been playing with everyone who's gotten this talk. We're going to play Find the Army. How many people can find the 1,000 people in this photograph? Anyone? No? So, there is, whenever my pointer decides to work, there is a command post here and some units behind it. We can follow it up the road then, and there's some more stuff, and there's a dude out in the open, and I know there's some stuff over here, but I've yet to find them, and we can look over here, and there's more dudes here, and the US is this really cool type of camouflage, which blends in with the natural background that makes people turn into rocks, so you can actually do that, and, you know, if you look at that, you can blend in and hide a lot of stuff in that gap. But you'll notice there's also an antenna there. And every soldier has tactical radios. So what if you just start gathering the data instead of looking for the soldiers? You can find them using electronic warfare. This is the disposition of those 1,000 people going the whole way back to the mountain, and it also includes this bit here. This is what's called a train. This is the logistics supply for those troops if they end up fighting. And if we then look at the number one question that I've been asked, why are the phone networks still up? Why do people have internet connectivity? And, you know, in a way, that's a really good question. But a lot of it comes down to both Russia and Ukraine have been using the phone networks for their own C2. Not all of them have tactical radios, and the tactical radios they do have sometimes are in the clear. So the only way to get communications out is to use phone calls. And something Ukraine has been doing is this.
Мою крайнюю конфету видели? Принял, я просто отбегал, не слышал рацию. 30 вправо, да?
Сейчас закидываю, у меня задержка была. Все, вы наблюдайте, все, пошло.
Еще туда? Или куда-то влево-право? Все, понял. Стоп! А, поздно, блядь. Все, стоим. Смотри внимательно. Я на телефоне.
So what they're actually doing in individual terms is they're trying to direct how they're using their fire using artillery. As well as that, we also end up with this. This is tactical radio communications that a friend of mine actually captured of Russian units, and I have the translation there as well.
Работаем на 16-й условной. Продолжаем работать на этой дорожке. Все находиться.
So, you can actually just sit and go along and do legitimate signals intelligence and gather the tactical communications that they're using. And this isn't a rocket science thing, because I have another one.
Багдад, я Рязань, прием. Ураган, я Рязань, прием.
So, the reason that the networks stay up is because Russia is desperately relying on them, and Ukraine is getting an incredible amount of intelligence out of using these systems. The other thing as well is that the final point I want to make is when we're talking about these, in military terms, these are known as computer network operations. And the ones everybody's kind of thinking about are computer network attacks. I've also mentioned computer network exploitation, using these systems to gather intelligence about what's going on. But no one's talking about defense. And I think the one thing that has been missing from any discussion that we have had about where are the cyber attacks is the incredible role that defense has actually played. There's a concept in military terms called battlefield shaping. Battlefield shaping is everything you do before the war starts to make sure the terrain is exactly as you want it. And this is the list of successes that have happened on the defense side. Beginning in November 2001, I am bad at words now. November 2021, where the US Cyber Command, along with civilian contractors, went into Ukraine, specifically going around critical pieces of infrastructure and bit by bit taking them apart and removing malware left, right, and center wherever they found it. This was in the Financial Times just last week. I have not seen people mentioning that this is the case all that often. Then in January of 2022, people saw that Viasat had their KA-SAT taken down and a number of communications receivers for it destroyed. The NSA in January put out a warning saying, if you have one of these VSAT terminals, update it. And all of a sudden, Ukraine, they continue to be able to use these systems because they paid attention to the intelligence that was coming in. Dragos in every, I think it's 3 month or so, publish these little knowledge packets for their customers, and they give you brief synopses on their blog of what's available. And they've discovered In-Destroyer, or as they call it, Crash Override, which was used previously to take down the power grid in Kyiv in 2016, and Black Energy, which was used to take down the same power grid in 2014. They talked about that in both January and in February. Microsoft Mystic detected Whispergate in the week leading up to it. ESET detected Hermetic Wiper after everything had begun. Microsoft detected something called Foxblade. We don't know anything about it, but within the hour of the attack's beginning, Microsoft had detected this attack, and then not just that, within 3 hours, they had patched the vulnerabilities that had gone into it. And then finally, Fortinet have been providing free DDoS protection to the Ukrainian police, who were the ones getting the brunt of DDoS attacks at the beginning of the campaign. So where are the cyber attacks? Primarily, problem is cyber is deeply misunderstood and people kind of think it's magic. But it isn't. The other thing is these things take time, investment to prepare and preposition. Russia had this and then it was taken away from them. Cyber has limitations. That's a shock to people. And as well as that, people have been thinking about this for a very long time. So this is just one of a range of options available to militaries. And sometimes things that go bang or boom are just more effective than cyber. And finally, the defensive efforts just aren't sexy, so they're underreported. So I'll take questions now, but I couldn't do this talk on my own, so I'd like to thank Tinfoil Jack and Aminal for wargaming ideas with me, helping me find some of the documents and for generally good crack along with it. Microbiote designed a ton of the graphics you've seen that I've used. David helped me get the signals intercepts that you've seen. Victor helped me translate them, and Sinan helped me with various pieces of linguistic support along the way. So thank you for listening.